Okay, thank you and good afternoon. Yes, I'm supposed to give you an introduction on the science of pharmacovigilance, which has this beautiful word, pharmacovigilance. And when we think of medicines, and pharmakon means medicine. So when we think of medicines, we first want to think about the bright side, which is the benefit and the way how medicines can heal us or even prevent disease if possible. But where there is light, there is also shadow. Next slide, please. And here is it, a very scary shadow. And that's what we actually are. We are vigilant. We watch out for the scary shadows of the medicines. Next slide, please. So pharmacovigilance is the science concerned with the risks of medicine. So risks is our scary shadows. Next slide, please. So what does it mean, risks, in concrete terms? What can we experience with medicines? Well, most often we refer to as the risks as the side effects, or as we call them technically, the adverse reactions. And that includes toxicity for the unborn child. And in fact, the thalidomide disaster of the 60s is the mother of pharmacovigilance. But also more trivial things like the non-fitness to drive, which can impair everyday life. Then also, and then obviously all the other adverse reactions which we know about. But I just wanted to show you here the range of things we look at. Then there is also overdose, misuse, and abuse, as this can lead to toxic effects in patients or also others who somehow are exposed to the medicines. Must not necessarily be a patient, could be a healthcare professional, for example, as well, who can be exposed to occupational exposure. That actually I forgot to mention, but there is more to the use than the use of the patient. There's also the off-label use. We had already discussion today about the use in children. Very often that is not included in the package leaflet, at least for old medicines, and that is also part of off-label use. Medication error is an area for risks which was more recently included about 10 years ago as the scope of pharmacovigilance. It evolved through the view that healthcare is more than just, it's not only the medicine, it's how the medicine is given, which can cause a problem. And in the risk management approach, which entered pharmacovigilance about 10 years ago, this was also included. And more recently, and that comes also very much also driven by a more global agenda, quality defects and counterfeits are included as they can be detected through pharmacovigilance. And people more and more argue that the scope should be broader. Lack of efficacy is something which has been there for a while and becomes more and more important, in fact, and particular for for medicines against life-threatening diseases or vaccines or contraceptives. It's a specific important area. But there could also be the underuse of medicines due to public scare, for example, in the vaccine area, which also becomes more and more the focus of pharmacovigilance and how to actually optimize communication so that the contrary of the overuse does not happen. Next slide, please. So, but what is risk actually? Here I want to give you a bit of the feeling of what experts have to consider when they look at risks with medicine. Do we actually talk about the harm, or is it potential for harm? There has been a debate. Here somebody is smiling next to me. Well, the harm is what already happened, but we have very much to look at what happens in the future and what should we prevent. So that's why we like the term risk, because it's like forward-looking perspective. We also distinguish between what has already been identified as a risk and also other things which we think maybe there could be something, and we call them potential risks. So we are basically dealing with known knowns, but also known unknowns. But we have always to keep in mind there could also be the thing we never even have thought about it, so we don't even know that there are potential risks because we don't know anything about it. And we would have examples of that as well. There is also a discussion, is a risk a probability? I mean, that was maybe a mathematical definition. The probability for an individual to experience a certain reaction when you're exposed to the medicine. And often that is derived from the frequency. So we see harm occurring in a patient population. We calculate a frequency, and doctors doctors usually use that frequency to tell you how likely you are to experience it, but it's a very statistical measure. More interestingly, it becomes when we look into more the qualitative aspects and the risk factors which can modify the risk of a certain patient. So the probability can actually be very different from the overall frequency. And we have to distinguish between serious and non-serious risks. So this is just, I know this is a lot, this is a quite complex slide, but I want to give you just the feeling this is a very complex science, has a lot of aspects, and for all those who are somehow involved in discussions, these are the background, the scientific background against which things will happen and what experts will have in mind. So I wanted to give you that flavor. Next slide, please. Now, in terms of quantitative risk measures, and now you have a whole series of slides which here in the colored version appear in black, have black headings. I have just put together for you a couple of definitions which are very frequently used in meetings. I cannot go through those definitions now, but I want that you can use your slides as a handout, and when you are in a meeting you can actually ask more questions and you can approach colleagues from the agency to help you also with the technical jargon. Here we are. So in pharmacovigilance, we're looking out for these risks. And next slide, please. Luckily, these risks are rare, because if they were not rare, we would not authorize the medicines in the first instance. So we are actually looking through with using a number of tools for the one needle in the haystack and the really nasty needle. That's what we are looking for. Next slide, please. And then once we have found that, we want to minimize the risk, so to keep patients as safe as possible. Next slide. So pharmacovigilance, now this is the definition from WHO. It's an old definition, but it's still valid and people use it. It's frequently referred. It's the science and the activities relating to the detection, assessment, understanding and prevention of adverse effects and any other medicine-related problem. So it opens the scope here. Next slide, please. So why do we have to do this? Well, because once a medicine, first a medicine is authorized basically on the basis of clinical trials. And as you all know, I think many of you have somehow been involved in this area. Clinical trials they're usually rather small. I mean, if you get a 3,000 patient exposure prior to authorization, that's already very good. Very often it's smaller, in particular in the orphan field, it would be very small. Now, it's only once the product is authorized that the medicine is used in thousands of patients, and they are all very different patients as compared to rather standardized patients, so to say, highly selected patients prior to the authorization. Because for a clinical trial, you need to have a certain case definitions. You have inclusion criteria, exclusion criteria. You want to basically not look at too many interactions with other diseases, because otherwise you can't evaluate the product anymore. But obviously in real life, people will not only have one disease, they might have another disease, they have genetic risk factors. I mean, we just had the discussion on the oral contraceptives. There are women who have a certain genetic predisposition for VTE, and all of that in a small trial population, you might not find that, but in the wider population, that's what we find. And then there is healthcare practice, the way how the medicine is used. There will be a dose forgotten, there will be a dose too much, somebody will use something intramuscular, which maybe should have given in a different way, or will miss the dosing schedule. Like, all sorts of things can happen, and they pose additional risks, and they give us information on the medicine. So that's why it's very important to have that pharmacovigilance as a main post-authorization activity. Next slide, please. Now, in terms of workflow, what do? It's a very traditional workflow. We collect data, and I'll come back to that in a minute, where they come from. Then they get analyzed. We look out for safety concerns and signals. The risks get assessed. Then there will be an assessment on the overall benefit-risk balance of the product, because depending on how big the benefit is, we could accept different risks. So, for example, if it's a medicine for a minor disease, which is self-limiting, your threshold for accepting any risk would be rather low. If you look for a cancer product where really it's a question of life and death, you might have a higher threshold for your risk acceptance. We do an option analysis, which means what options do we have to minimize the risk. They can vary. We can restrict an indication. In the worst case, we take a product off the market. But very usually, we update the product information with better advice how to manage the risk and prevent patients, or if an adverse reaction occurs, how to detect it quickly and limit its impact. And then we look at communication. We just had a great session on that topic already. And ideally, we would also evaluate the effectiveness of risk minimization action. Now, this is a legal mandate in the framework of risk management for a certain risk minimization action. It's not yet there for the whole pharmacovigilance process. Now, next slide. When we look at the tools which we have available for the data collection and the assessment and all these steps I've just been quickly mapping out, there is most traditionally what we call spontaneous reporting of adverse reactions. And that is when somebody, it can be the patient or the healthcare professional, makes an observation and things like, oh, I didn't have this skin. It looked different yesterday, and now I'm taking this medicine for a couple of days, and maybe there is a relationship between what my skin is showing and the fact what I'm taking. So this spontaneous thought, that is called spontaneous reporting then when that's put together in a report. We have additional monitoring as a new tool, and we'll have a little video at the end of my talk. Additional monitoring is a tool to enhance the spontaneous reporting. Obviously, more formally, we have studies, so they don't depend on somebody thinking all of a sudden there could be some causal relationship, but it's a formal study like a clinical trial, but it's a study in a healthcare environment. So it doesn't have all the experimental features a clinical trial has, in particular the allocation to the product and to the treatment is done by the healthcare professional as it would be done in normal healthcare. That is the very, very important feature. Then if we have a signal either coming from spontaneous reporting or from post-authorization safety studies, which mean we have a suspicion there could be an additional risk we did not know before or we only knew partially about, then we enter this information in a course of signal management. Then we have also PSURs, which periodic safety update reports. It's a document from marketing authorization holders to compile at regular level certain data. We have risk management plans, which are more proactive looking. We have a process for incident management, which is a very quick review. And I think there was a question this morning about timelines. Yes, the review process takes usually a month at least, if not longer, depending on the kind of data. But we have a quick response network. The incident management looks at each information very quickly, and if there is an urgent issue, things can be speed up, and they could be done within a week or 24 hours, and we had that in the past. So there are various timelines. Continuous conduct of pharmacovigilance and monitoring evaluation of benefit-risk balance is another process to not lose track and basically tracking products through the post-authorization phase. Next slide, please. Now, new tools we have is, and you had a lot of questions already, how are your voice heard? And we have public participation models now in the new legislation. Public hearings will come soon, and that will give us the opportunity to get your experience and priorities and opinions upon things much earlier into the assessment process. Safety communication was also a process which was enhanced with the legal legislation, and we had the discussion already. International collaboration is also, this was also a question already this morning. Yes, we have bilateral as well as international collaboration. Pharmacovigilance systems are also quality assured. We have quality management systems, and we have audits for ourselves, which means as regulators, and we have inspections of industry. And that was always very early in 2004. We had a paper with the patient working group at the time, and a big request for auditing of the systems, and that is now there in place. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, now the patient roles, for me, obviously, there would be no pharmacovigilance without the patient. We do this everything for you. So actually, patients are in the center of what we're doing. The majority of patients will be included in or involved with pharmacovigilance as the user of information, of reading the package leaflet, hopefully. So on a very sort of end user side. But then we have obviously possibilities to be involved in processes, and we had already the example of being involved in review of the product information and the safety announcement. Spontaneous reporting is now an opportunity. For the last 10 years, member states have been increasingly opened up their reporting systems at national level for patient reporting. And since 2010, since the new legislation has kicked in, or 2012 actually, it became legally binding, all member states have to give patients the opportunity to report themselves adverse reactions. Obviously, people can become a study participant or a participant in the registry, and that would hugely contribute to the data collection. But then, as I said, public hearings give us another tool to listen early on and take your views on board in the assessment. And then we have patient experts at the various regulatory fora, like the Scientific Advice Group, Ad hoc Expert Group, and the PRAC. The next slide, please, the Pharmacovigilance Risk Assessment Committee. Now, Albert and Marco are the representatives from the patients, and we'll have comments from him basically tomorrow, and I think we can probably send the slides to you that you can also have his view on how the involvement is. But maybe from my perspective, the patient view is very important and very well respected by the PRAC and frequently solicited. And it's not only about communication aspects, but about all aspects that patients raise questions, important questions, and bring the real-life view into things, but also sometimes a political view upon things, because you have a lot of information about how companies advertise things, how they interact with healthcare professionals, a lot of knowledge which we actually cannot have, which you bring in. So that's really great. And maybe David would maybe afterwards settlement, because he was also in the pilot project. You were observer in the Pharmacovigilance Working Party. The role was very similar, and maybe you wanted to add something. Next slide, please. Yes, that's what we want. You. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Priya. You made it very timely. Thank you. I never thought that Donald Rumsfeld would end up with his unknown unknowns in pharmacovigilance. Regarding the PRAC, as it consists now, actually, before we went to the Pharmacovigilance Working Party as guinea pigs, Albert and I, the concerns were very similar as they were voiced at the SACs. We have seen them this morning, and currently the concerns are even bigger at the CHMP, and they are very similar. So after 2 meetings at the PRAC, when they knew that we would not return after the third one, they were crying for us because they recognized the value we brought to the meeting and the different perspective we brought to the meeting. And this makes the experience very rich for us, and I'm grateful to have been there at the time. I know Albert will talk tomorrow, and you can grab him tomorrow about what it is now at the PRAC.